Welcome, friends. It's wonderful to have so many of you here to learn about the approach that we call radical listening at Health and Harmony. At its most fundamental, this approach is an approach that recognizes the profound interconnectedness of living systems. And I know that that's something that this pandemic is making painfully clear to all of us. The health of ecosystems, humans, and economic systems are simply not separate. And so what I'm going to show you today is an approach that recognizes this interconnectedness and the interconnectedness of solutions. And it's dramatically more effective than many different approaches that people use. And the key element is that the people who know the solutions are those who are experiencing the problem. So first, for those of you who don't know, I'm going to tell you a little bit about Health and Harmony as well. And I'm just going to give you a broad overview of what is radical listening. So we call this approach, first of all, radical, because we actually listen to what people say. It's listening to a group with true recognition that they are the experts. It's a process to find these big consensus solutions. And it's accessing the greater wisdom in the whole. Each one of us individually don't always know what the solutions are, but together we can find them. And then it's really radical because we not only listen to the communities and ask them what the solutions are, but then we implement those solutions. It's about community governance and agency, i.e. they are asked what the solutions are. They feel that they have, they feel that they have designed whatever solutions there are and implemented. And that way they have much more ownership of the whole process. We also call this a means of reciprocity. It's a way for the world to say thank you to communities, and it's a way for the communities to give something back. It's not about charity. It's about knowing that we are all interconnected. As I said, this pandemic is teaching us very profoundly what that's like. So I want to talk a little bit about how this process first developed. So I went to Aceh after the tsunami. That's a part of Indonesia. And it was, it was a horrific scene. Hundreds of thousands of people had died. There were nonprofits and aid agencies from all over the world. Pretty much every single relief organization in the world was represented there. And they were all doing their thing. And no one was listening to the communities. And it was this, I remember this really profound, big aid agency, like coordination meeting that we were all having. And one group who was very unusual, a small Indonesian nonprofit that actually spoke Indonesian. And they said, the communities are saying, thank you very much for the healthcare, but really if you're in the wave, you either died or you survived, and there kind of wasn't that much in between. Thank you for the tents, that's very helpful. But really what we need, and we very much appreciate the rice, but what we really need is to be able to clear our rice fields of all the debris from the ocean so that we can plant. And it was like a bomb had been dropped in this meeting. There was just total silence. And millions and millions and millions of dollars had been donated for relief work. And they all just said, sorry, that's not in our brief, we don't do that. We give out rice, we provide healthcare, we provide shelter, we don't clear rice fields. And it just felt to me like, what are you talking about? Like, how can we not address truly the most fundamental issue here? And these communities are right. If they don't get their rice fields cleaned, then they won't be able to plant and they won't have food in 3 months. And they'll be dependent on the aid. And that just felt like a profound misplacing of the way to approach this problem. So at that time, I actually decided, I had been in Indonesia to study orangutans before that time, and I had discovered then that one of the main reasons that people were logging the rainforest was to pay for healthcare. So I had gone to medical school with the plan to come back, and I thought I would work for some other nonprofit. But instead, after that experience at Aceh, I decided that we would found our own nonprofit called Health in Harmony, and that it would be based on the principle of listening to communities. And that is what we've done. So we began working around the national park where I first studied orangutans, called Gunung Palung National Park. And in the first year of the program, we spent an enormous number of hours listening to communities. Partly we spent so many hours because I thought every single community around the park would have a different answer, but they did not. Okay, sorry, I'm just checking making sure that my questions, I think we have someone else on the call, Trina, who will also jump in and let me know if there are any specific questions that need to be addressed as I'm going along. So we listened to the communities, we asked them what would be the solutions. And the way that we framed it, we said, you all are guardians of a precious rainforest that is valuable to the whole world. What would you all need so that, as a thank you from the world community, so that you could actually protect this forest? And they were very, very clear. They said that they needed healthcare access and they needed training in sustainable agriculture. Now, like I said, when I first started, all of these solutions are interconnected, right? All of the problems are interconnected. And these kind of system solutions are really key. So that's what we did. We did exactly what they said. 10 years later, there was a 90% drop in logging households, a 67% drop in infant mortality, and we stabilized the loss of primary forests, and we had 52,000 acres of forest grow back, which is equivalent to the difference in the amount of carbon that would have been released with sort of business as usual in comparison to other national parks, was equivalent to $53 million. This wasn't really charity. The communities asked for help for these solutions to protect forests that they wanted to protect. The world community was able to meet those needs, and it was a huge success on both sides. The forest was protected, the climate was protected, and the communities did better. So this process basically has 3 steps. The first step is you determine the root causes of the problem and the overarching solutions. That is done. I'll explain in great detail how we do that. And then step 2 is basically, I'm not going to talk that much about that today, but what it is we basically bring people together. Those are all of the leaders after we've had meetings with all the communities. And we ask them to give us the specific details of those solutions. So for example, let's say that we just did this in Madagascar, and the communities there said they needed healthcare, again, to be able to protect the forest. In step 2, we brought together all the leaders, and those leaders, we said, okay, so we know you want healthcare. What is that healthcare going to look like? Is it a clinic? Is it mobile clinics? What do you need and what do you want? What's the best way to actually create that problem, to actually create that solution? They immediately agreed that they wanted mobile clinics because transportation is a huge problem. We asked where those should be, broke them up into different regions because we weren't going to be able to go to every single one of the 30 villages. 15 minutes, they came back and they said, okay, we've agreed on all the locations. So this is, that's step 2. Step 3 is signing what we call a reciprocity agreement. In that signing of that agreement, it basically is a very loose agreement. It is really basically a desire on both sides to meet the needs, but it allows for the evolution of things as time goes along. On the community side, it says we agree that we will try and protect the forest. And on the on our side, it says that we will meet the needs that you have asked for. And that doesn't mean like 100% all the time meet everything that they ask for, but in these basic areas, we've agreed that we will meet them. So I want to start off by giving an example of when this didn't work. So at Gunung Palung National Park, which is our first location that we started in Indonesian Borneo, we asked the communities how we were going to design every single part of the program except one, and that was the monitoring of whether or not there was logging. And what we had agreed with the communities is that they would receive discounts with healthcare if they were protecting the forest. And so that meant if there was no logging at all, they would get more of a discount than if there was a lot of logging. And so, but I didn't ask the communities about how to design the monitoring because I thought they would cheat. And so we were using the national park staff to do that. And that, let's just say, didn't work. And about a year and a half in, we had to go back to the communities and say, we're so sorry. It looks like the data is incorrect. And they're like, no, the data is definitely incorrect. And so I had to say, I'm sorry, can you please help us figure this out? And so they said, the best way to do this is to have one person in every single village. We agreed to call them best friends of the forest. And these folks knew every single logger individually. They would help monitor, and they would also help find solutions on an individual family basis. And that has been wildly successful. So I always just feel like every single part of the program should really be designed by the communities. So I am an American. I come from a culture in which we often believe that individuals are greater than the group. When I talk about these beliefs to Indonesians, they're like, that can't be possible that you really believe that. But I'm afraid if there are those of you who are listening who are also from Western cultures, you'll probably agree that we tend to believe these things. We tend to believe that accomplishing a task is much more important than relationship, that faster is better. We tend to be very focused on short-term thinking and think that meetings waste time, competitiveness is good, and that asking reveals weakness and ignorance. That as the international experts, we should come in and know exactly what to do. We once did some radical listening for another organization, and they said, well, how are you going to figure out what the communities need? I was like, well, we're going to ask them. And they're like, you can't possibly do that. These people are, they have no education, they're extremely poor. You're the ones who have to come in and determine what they need. I'm like, no. These communities are the experts. And in fact, most of these things are actually the flip, right? That when you reveal that you don't know, there's actually more trust that's built. That the group is actually much more powerful than the individual. And that if we really want to think long-term and really actually achieve long-term success, then relationships are one of the most important parts of that. So this process of radical listening, it finds the key fulcrums of change. In this process of listening to a group, they will come up with what are the key issues. This is a term that's really hard. Sometimes people use the word empowerment, but I hate that word because it's as though I have the power or we have the power and we're giving it to them. They already have the power. It just recognizes the agency that the communities already have. The other thing that's really interesting is how one goes about starting a program might be much more important than the what. What I mean by that is, let's say in some magical world, you could go into a community and know exactly what they need. That process, if you were to then impose it, is different even if those were the same answers, the same solutions, than if the communities themselves come up with the solutions. They have much more ownership of it. They're much more excited. They're much more engaged with the process if they are the ones who determine what the solutions are. And they're much more likely to actually implement those solutions if they came up with them. When we first began around Gorong Palong, they determined that one of the things that they wanted was organic farming training, which totally surprised me. But it took me a little bit of time to find someone from the next door island of Java to come and do this. It took me about 6 months. But in that interim time, every single time we were in any of the communities, people would come up to me and say, when are we getting that organic farming training? They really wanted it. And sure enough, when we began it, just people came right in to immediately do it because it was their idea. So it's very efficient and effective in that way. And it builds on this behavior change data. So all of us, when we're wanting to change our behavior, we start off with pre-contemplation. We then go to like, okay, I've decided I want to do this. And then there's the big activation energy to actually do the change. And then there's some relapse. This process is basically asking, what are you guys already ready to do? So maybe in some theoretical world, there's a better solution than what the communities want to do, but it's not really better because they want, this is what they're ready to do. This is where their energy already is. And so if you then implement those things, they're on it, right? Otherwise, you have to try to first convince people to move into the, okay, now I want to adopt that, whatever you're suggesting. There's a great quote from Margaret Mead that I love. Truly seeking to know others demands the open-mindedness with which one must look and listen, record in astonishment and wonder that which one would not have been able to guess. Okay, interbeing. We have lived our lives by the assumption that what was good for us would be good for the world. We have been wrong. We must change our lives so that it will be possible to live by the contrary assumption. What is good for the world will be good for us. And that requires that we make the effort to know the world and know and learn what is good for it. So when I talked in the beginning about this idea of interbeing, that all of our well-being on this planet is completely intertwined. And I learned this from one of my professors in medical school who used to say that the secret of caring is caring. If you approach people with genuine interest and curiosity, genuine love, people feel it. They know that they can sense that in themselves. If you're always truthful and admit when you don't know, people are more likely to trust you. Respect, humility, and recognizing these intertwined well-beings. It's also true that when you feel more comfortable, it impacts other people's comfort. So I'd love to usually end this with a interbeing exercise where you really begin to feel that how that intertwined salvations as a beautiful, as an Aboriginal woman, Lila Watkins, I believe her name is, likes to say that if you've come here to help me, then go home. But if you've come because you recognize that our well-beings, that our salvations are intertwined, then you are welcome. So we do these, we have half-day trainings. We also do, we can do a follow-up training and review, and with all of the exercises that we've cut out from today. And we could also have like just a very specific time where we could answer your questions about your organization or how some of these ideas might be applicable to your work. So I'm going to now shift. I'm going to exit this, and we are going to just focus on questions. So, and here's our website. Also on that website is a lot of information about more extensive radical listening trainings. We're also, just so you all know, we're working on ways of trying to do this more virtually. This is a little taste of that, but of course with the exercises as well. So let's see. Oh, good. And hi, Trina.
Hi, Kinari. So we've got a couple questions coming in. Thanks so much for your presentation. That was great. And yeah, we've got some great questions. And if anybody else wants to ask questions, please go ahead and put them into the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen, and we'll get to as many of them as we can today. So the first one that we have is from an anonymous attendee, actually, but they say, I can do near a dozen of these listening conversations in a week. Sometimes I blow it and I'm not present enough. I'm too tired, or I say something that puts us off track. Sometimes somebody will lie to me and I'll get angry. I've not always been able to repair those relationships. Do you have any tips?
Yeah. Yeah. I hear you, right? First of all, listening is just, it's hard, right? So there's listening to individuals, right? And then there's listening to groups. And those are slightly different things. Well, they're quite different things, really. But the skills are very similar, right? So those listening to individuals is like building your muscle for listening to a group. And yeah, right? Like dealing with anger, it's super, super difficult. And if we do have mirrored emotions, which means those emotions arise in us, even if it's not our anger. And it can be hard to repair those relationships. But if you can look at what is the underlying question in this anger, that can often really help. What boundary has been violated and what needs to be restored? And if you can just approach that person understanding that fundamental question, and even just asking them that question, what needs to be restored in your life? What got broken here? That can often really fix it. And people's emotions often will really calm down when they realize that you've really heard them. Okay, Trina.
Great. We've got another one here from Nicole saying, this approach sounds very similar to good focus group practices for qualitative research. From your perspective and experience, what is the core difference, either in the process or in the outcome?
Yeah, so it is, many of these skills are very similar, right? So absolutely, this is much like a focus group. I tend to say it's radical, partly because we actually do what communities say, right? So we're really going to implement that. And we're really asking them for the broad solutions. So often focus groups are done around, we already know what we're going to do. We're just now asking you guys to refine it or get your input around something. This is a process of a very broad question and allowing them to answer within a very, very broad context, what are the solutions? Communities will often say, yeah, we've been asked our opinion about programs, but we've never been asked to actually come up with what the solutions are. And to actually be trusted that we know what the solutions are. It's a little different. Yeah, but similar.
Okay, so here's one saying, your program in Indonesian Borneo is looking at illegal logging of a national park.
Yes.
Have you had experience, or do you see the potential for this approach to work on privately owned forested land that is being legally cleared for palm oil or other monoculture farming in a similarly underserved location where needs are the same?
Yeah, so we actually worked in some communities in central Kalimantan where they had large areas of land that were they had some legal claim to them, some sort of ancestral claim to them. to the point where some palm oil companies who were planning to come in kind of needed to get their permission and probably pay them to some degree for this land. Now, the communities didn't want actually to sell this land to the palm oil companies. They had seen the law in other communities. They'd seen the horrible loss of livelihoods. They talked about, well, what they said was, if we had these things, we did radical listening with them. If we had these things, then we would not have to sell our land to the palm oil companies and become slaves to them. In most places, the local communities have to have some agreement, even if it's just that they don't fight it, right? And if their needs can actually be addressed, they often don't want to go that route. I've never met anyone anywhere in the world who actually wants to destroy their ecosystem. But they often do want certain things that they really need in their communities, right? Like in those communities, they said, we want fish farming training, we want water filters because we're getting sick all the time from the river where we're drinking from, who we're also pooping in. And we need training of our healthcare providers. We have a good hospital some distance away, but the folks who live in our communities can't tell when someone is sick enough to need to go to the hospitals. So those were very clear, simple things. And they said with those things, we would be independent and we would not need to have our land destroyed. Yeah.
Here's a great question. Have you ever worked with for-profit companies in this training? And if so, what have other organizations, or how have other organizations chosen to apply this technique?
Yeah, so we have worked, we have worked with for-profit companies. They often are interested in like a CSR or corporate social responsibility, and want a better relationship with the communities and want to use their funds to support the communities in a way that is the most impactful, is the most respectful. And in this process of listening to the communities and then doing what they say, there's much more trust is built. So that's we would be delighted to work with you also if you have a for-profit company or so, yeah.
Leanne is wondering, how do you approach a community or get invited into a community that you want to work with?
Yeah. So for us so far, that's been kind of a serendipitous process, which is to say we sometimes, it's kind of a mixed process, I would say. Sometimes we're like, okay, we really want to look for the forest that's the most threatened, the most, like that's actually how we ended up in Madagascar. So they've lost 80% of their forest, incredibly biodiverse forest, enormous community needs. And so we kind of, looking at the triage of the planet, we said, okay, Madagascar is really one of those places we need to work. Sometimes we're hoping, we were planning this year to start in Brazil. We'll see how the pandemic goes, whether we're starting later in the year or maybe in the beginning of next year. But that was because we had lots of Brazilian friends who really desperately wanted us to go there. We then checked out a whole bunch of different sites and found the best partner relationships. I think there's lots of different ways you can end up working in communities, but I think this process works wherever you end up. We have yet to find a place that doesn't work. Let me just put it that way. It might not work somewhere, but we haven't found that place yet. What's next, Rita?
So from Anne, she's wondering, you've worked in Indonesia, Madagascar, Brazil. What have you learned about radical listening from this background? Does this process need to be tailored?
So it doesn't need to be tailored that much. I'm really surprised how much it works in radically different cultures. We've done it also in the Philippines. We've done it all the way across Indonesia. And of course, Indonesia has many, many, many different cultures. in Madagascar, in Brazil, in the US. It's remarkably, it's a pretty simple process. So it lends itself to working in different cultures. Yeah. Yeah. I'm surprised how much we haven't had to change it.
Yeah. Similarly, Don is asking about more detail or examples about adjusting approaches in different cultures or legal systems. Is it a matter of spending more time and developing deeper relationships in order to be successful in those listening sessions?
I mean, that's what the listening sessions are about, right? They're about developing trust and listening to the communities what the solutions are. And they are going to tell you culturally appropriate things, and they're going to tell you things that are, that are appropriate within a certain legal context. In Madagascar, for example, there are cultural rules, like traditional law, which you can't write down. Right. So that was very important for us to know. And in our, in our reciprocity agreements, we did not write down certain things. They were very clear about what could be written down and what couldn't. Yeah.
Okay, I think this is a great question from Court. If we already know what we want to do, what if what you want to do isn't something that's a priority for the communities? How do you strike the balance, and would you ever pull the pin completely?
Well, what we do is not what we want to do. It's what the communities want. And if, and you may have some really cool thing that you're just going to do regardless. And that's fine. But I think if we're really going to address these kind of systemic problems, it requires that you ask the communities, and it requires that you get those key fulcrums of change. And those are really only going to come from the communities. And I think when we begin to think about the kind of systems level solutions that need to happen, you look at conservation programs. With respect, there aren't that many successful conservation programs in the world. And there are very few that have been as successful as we have been. And I believe that that's because most conservation programs are not really understanding this intimate interconnectedness. They say, we're a conservation program, we don't do healthcare. But if the reason that people are logging the forest is to pay for healthcare, then if you don't do healthcare, you're not addressing the problem. And so, I think you just have to ask what the real fundamental underlying issues are about why this thing is happening. People usually no one wants it. We've never met anyone anywhere in the world who wants a destroyed ecosystem. But if they don't have certain needs met, they might not be able to have what they want. Yeah.
Great. Lorianne is saying thanks. It's great to learn from you directly. So health and harmony practices radical listening for needs assessment. Do you need a process for making decisions with a participatory approach then, or is radical listening enough?
Yeah, so we sort of have these three levels. So, well, really four, I should actually say. So the first one is this process of kind of loosely finding out what the solutions are. Now, I forgot to say this, but this is super important. So everywhere that we have been, in any given ecosystem region, every single community will come to the same solutions independently. That's why I got much less stressed about who was in each group, because they would always come to the same conclusion. And in the beginning of the meeting, no one would know what the answer was. But an hour and a half later, they got there. And so, in that process of so we find out in a given region, okay, these are the solutions for that region. They're different in different regions, but they're the same within the groups, right? So like they say, there's 30 communities who live around the national park. They will all come to the same conclusions. There's another region here where there's a river. They'll have different solutions along the river. Although we have yet to be anywhere where healthcare wasn't an element of it. So that's sort of like step one. Step 2 is to get the concrete details of exactly how you're going to implement those, right? So that's usually we meet with the village leaders and we say, okay, healthcare, but how exactly is the healthcare going to look? We're going to do organic farming training. How exactly are we going to do that training? And then the reciprocity agreement. And then there's a process of follow up with the community on a regular basis. Like, okay, we're trying this. How's it going? Right? Is this working? That's usually how we do it. And things need to be refined sometimes. They work for a period of time, but then there's another problem that arises because suddenly we've solved that, but now there's this issue. Like, for example, in the communities around Gorompalong, there was no price for manure when we started. No one knew you could use it for anything. After we did the organic farming training, suddenly there was a price for manure, and then people were hoarding it, and then no one would even sell it because it was just too valuable to even sell. And so then we had to figure out ways to get more manure in the community. So, yeah.
There's been a couple questions about commitment to stay in the communities after these radical listing sessions. Do you intend to stay in these sites in the same capacity for an indefinite period of time? Or is there a plan for altering your role, leaving entirely? Is it important that you then live in the community for months or a year?
Yeah, so all the communities where we work, we have a long-term commitment to them because we have a long-term commitment to the rainforest. And we know that if we're going to survive as human species on this planet, then we have to have a rainforest. And I do believe that a long-term commitment is important. You know, the 3-year cycle of most grants is ridiculous. It takes usually longer than that to really make a big impact. After 5 years, we'd had a 68% drop in logging households. And after 10 years, we'd had a 90% drop, right? I do think part of that, I know because we didn't really know what we were doing in the beginning, and I do think we can go faster at other locations, but it's still going to take time. And then if you stopped those interventions, they might just go back to logging, right? So there likely has to be a continuation. Yeah. If we're going to do radical listening in a community, we don't always necessarily work there, but we are very clear that in the beginning, we're asking you what the solutions are. We're not making a commitment at this point that we're going to work here. We need to just understand what the solutions are. This may be helpful to you to know what the solutions are, but if we're not going to meet those solutions, we promise you that we will get that information to people who potentially can. Right. So that's usually what we do if we're not going to actually work, or if we don't know if we're going to work in a community. Okay,
There's a question about monitoring and evaluation, which a couple of people have asked about. So building on the example you shared at the beginning about the situation when this method wasn't working right, the lack of agreement about how monitoring should be done. Can you share more on how to design monitoring and evaluation plans that do work?
Well, again, I think it's very context specific. So I think you have to ask the communities how to best do the monitoring. That's where we messed up, right? We didn't ask the communities how to do that. And I was really surprised how they did know how to do it. Yeah. That's just all I can say. Ask the communities. It's going to be very context specific. And they'll know the exact details of how things are done and how people might cheat and et cetera. Yeah.
Okay, so here's one. There are many stories of commercial logging and mining that override local concerns, often with violence. Does Health and Harmony work in these situations, and how?
So Health and Harmony at this point does not work in those situations. I have certainly been places like that, and I've often said, the communities here need lawyers more than anything else, right? So I think there's a real role for community rights, working on those issues, trying to, oppose companies. That's not the element that we work on. But it's real interesting because there was a study done that looked at the loss of carbon in tropical rainforests. And they found that 30% of the loss of carbon is from companies, and 69% was from individuals logging, right? And that is mostly people who don't want to do it, just don't have another choice, right? So that's the element that we work on. And I'm not saying that the 30% is not important. I think that's super important, and I want people to work on that. I just think that sadly there are very few people who are working on this realm of how do we meet the needs of communities so that they can do what they want to do, which is protect the forest. When we first began around Gunung Palung, 98% of the community already wanted to protect the forest. They just weren't able to. And that's what we found everywhere we've been. And it's not just rainforests. So we did radical listening in Raja Ampat with fishing communities, and they talked about having to seriously overfish like 300 pounds of dried cucumbers for one medical emergency, or bombing the coral reefs for in order to get money for medical care. And they fully 100% understood that damaged their long-term well-being. But if your short-term well-being is very threatened, then you don't really have a choice.
This question is a bit similar, but after listening to the communities and understanding the solutions they want, do you have ideas for how to convince other decision makers, say from the government or businesses or even others from the community, to respect and act on, or at least not block, these solutions?
Well, so one of the things is, if you do these listening sessions in many places in the community, it's an amazing process, because then they know what the solutions are, right? They often didn't recognize that, or they'd never done that together before. And suddenly when everyone is like, oh, well, these are the solutions. And that kind of, my experience is that even the folks who weren't in the meetings all know, that information just spreads super fast. And people love these meetings. They're like, my God, this is so much fun. Can we do this again next week? I'm like, no, because if we do it again next week, the answer is going to be the same. So, and then the government knows too. They tell the government, we tell the government, and then the government kind of has to begin to address those things as well, because everyone now knows those are the solutions. Yeah.
So recent climate and biodiversity reports, like those from the IPCC, have concluded that the views and perspectives of Indigenous people and local communities are important. Their knowledge and understanding of large regions and ecosystems is undervalued, and their ideas for its future development is too often ignored. So is radical listening
beautifully said.
That's a good way to better value or access that knowledge.
Exactly. Exactly. The communities are the experts. And Indigenous knowledge about how to protect forests, and how it's just like, that is the answer. That's how we're going to survive on this planet, is respecting and honoring that wisdom. And then, they know what the solutions are, but they often can't meet them. And why can they not meet them? Usually because of a long history of colonialism, right? Why do they not have resources? Why do they not have access? That's why. And so being able to meet those needs with total love, honor, and respect for those communities is magical. It works. Yeah.
So you also mentioned that one of the reasons this approach is unique or disruptive is that your organization is previously committed to investing in realizing the community's ideas. Have you ever implemented or invested in a community design solution that you thought was going to fail? And if so, how did you manage that situation?
Yeah, I did not possibly think that organic farming was going to work. But we did it anyway, and I was wrong, right? Also the monitoring, the community monitoring. I was like, ooh, I had a hard time believing that was going to work. But we just had to trust they were right. We had to convince donors to pay for it when I didn't even necessarily believe it was going to work. But but it did. Worked beautifully. Beautifully. So yeah, now it's like, I'm going to trust the communities because they can see things that I can't see. Like organic farming was really interesting. At the 5-year anniversary party, one of the village chiefs, he said, when I designed this program, because he did help design this program, he said, I really got it right because me on organic farming is essential. He said, look, he said, now in my village, there used to be hundreds of loggers. He said, now there are less than 10. And the main difference is that these loggers could stop logging because they didn't need the startup money for expensive chemical fertilizers. They could make their own fertilizers. And so then they could just shift really easily. Whereas before they would have had to do a whole bunch of logging in order to get enough money to be able to buy the chemical fertilizers, to be able to plant. And then, and it was sort of this endless cycle. So that kind of broke the cycle in a way that I never, as an outsider, I never could have even understood that or imagined it or, yeah.
All right. I think we've got time for our remaining questions here.
Okay.
Yanti's wondering, how did you ensure that the voice of the most vulnerable are represented in the consensus that you built?
Yeah. So certainly women are very often are more vulnerable. And like I said, so we really want to try to call out and I never want to call on a specific person, but are there, are there women within the group that feel differently about this? The solutions that we're looking for are very broad solutions, though. They're not, there can be disabled folks in the community who may have very specific needs. And often those were things that we began to address sort of later in the program. But really this kind of overarching things were things that were needed for the whole community, right? And that impacted everyone. So, and we found that in every time we would have these meetings, we would, those same issues would arise, right? So addressing those major needs first and then beginning to address maybe smaller groups and what their needs are.
Here's a question about our current situation. How can radical listening come alive in Western cultures in which there's a bias against it? And are there ways that we can use radical listening in the COVID-19 pandemic to bring together communities in ways that haven't happened before?
Yeah. So, of course, this pandemic began in these wet markets, right? In China, and they're not just in China, they're across many, across Africa and many different parts of Southeast and South Asia. And, this is about invasion into forest, into areas and about eating, and it's not just this pandemic, right? SARS came from there, Ebola comes from, HIV came from forests. When forest is protected and people can live, like what we've seen at Gunung, the forest is thriving. The forest has grown back. The forest is happy and healthy, and the communities are wealthier and happier and healthier, right? So can we think about ways that don't see the natural ecosystem as in opposition to humans, that we have to kind of choose between one or the other, but that both can thrive? And can we address those areas of a sort of conflict that don't have to be conflict, that could be mutual thriving? And recognize that those are not just important for those communities, but important for the health of the whole world. Yeah, we got to prevent future pandemics, and we got to prevent climate change, right? This is the one, this is an enormous speed bump and a horrible and very sad thing that's happening to this planet right now. But in the road of life, climate change may be the end of the road, right? And what we're learning now is really, truly how amazing the planet, if we all work together, look what we can do in matters of weeks, right? So like, let's give us this time, right? Like and we're learning that sometimes you have to take a little bit of short-term pain for long-term gain. We need to do that with the climate change crisis as well. And we need to be able to, we have an opportunity here to shift the way we do things, right? In any crisis, suddenly things seem possible that didn't seem possible before. Can we begin to listen to Indigenous wisdom? Can we find solutions where we all work together? Can we truly recognize our interconnectedness? And can we truly recognize that we will only thrive on this planet together if we're all thriving, including the natural world? Thank you.
All right, with a few minutes remaining, I'm going to prioritize some of the questions that are getting votes from other participants.
Okay, good.
So is there...
Wait, you didn't answer this one.
Is there a path forward for communities to continue implementing new solutions without help from Health and Harmony? And I think that's kind of related to another one about sustainability. How do we define program sustainability in the long term?
So imagine a world where where there were armies of radical listeners. That's not such a good word. Like happy groups of amazing folks who are like going out and listening, doing radical listening all over the world. And they're uploading that information so that communities, so that Indigenous wisdom and knowledge is known about what the solutions are. And then we're using technology to match those needs from all over the world with, I meet people everywhere in the world who are like, I want to make a difference for this planet. I just don't know what to do. And they say, I don't know what to do either, but I know who knows, right? And so if we could just match that knowledge, and that's really, I think one of the other things we're learning about in this pandemic is just how much is possible virtually. And can we connect communities to folks all over the world, funds? That's what I envision. That's what I want to try to create. We'll see if we can pull it off. If anyone wants us to fund us to do that, we're like right and ready. We've even got the programmers to do it. Just need a little money. So
great. So here's one from Elizabeth. Successful follow-up to radical listening requires flexibility in implementing solutions, and many NGOs do not have that flexibility to work outside of solutions that are in their mandate. Have you seen any other NGOs successfully embrace radical listening and implement the needed solutions?
Yes, we absolutely have seen a lot of other ones, even when it's outside of their wheelhouse. And sometimes the way to do that is to partner with other organizations that are good at that thing, right? So, okay, we hear you that you need this. We're not great at that, but we'll partner with someone else who is, right? So yeah, we've seen lots of different organizations do it. It's really fun to watch it begin to spread. Yeah.
All right. Oh, I'm seeing a suggestion for radical listening tribes as opposed to armies.
Perfect. I love it.
All right. Let's see here. What mental barriers to radical listening would you identify as the most challenging to overcome? Within a group, what might be the critical mass of radical listeners necessary to change prevailing dynamics based on your experience?
Yeah, so, this idea, there is a very pervasive idea, which is really a problem, about experts knowing the solutions, right? And that education somehow gets you to this point, right? I'm a physician, right? Oh, and I went to a very prestigious school. Oh, surely I know all the answers, right? Bullshit. I don't know the answers. And having that humility and knowing that Indigenous cultures have thousands of years of knowledge, and trusting that wisdom is extremely difficult for many people. And even when you get the solutions, believing that those truly are the solutions and that they'll work, I admit that I just did it on faith, but I was stunned how well it worked. And, you know, I just think that the more that we can demonstrate, wow, look, over and over again in so many places in the world, the community solutions work when you implement them. And it saves so much more money, because otherwise we're implementing all these things that don't even work, right? But if you just, boom, exactly what the key fulcrums of change are, that's really powerful. Oops, I can't hear
Sorry,
you,
I was
Adrina.
muted there. So I think time for one last question, which is perfect. So how do you manage community impacts of conservation programs that exclude Indigenous and other groups from forests and fishing, etc.?
Yeah, I don't even, you know, I just feel like that's so fundamentally wrong. I don't even really know how to get there. And it's sort of, and it's not true anyway, because they're likely to still be involved, right? So there may be legal structures which say they're not supposed to be, but they are. And so just honoring them and working with what is the true reality on the ground. Oh, I also realized in the last question, I forgot to answer the, like, how many do you need? Like, how many people within a group, if they shift, um, can shift the cultures? I don't know, but I always believe the power of one can actually be very powerful. If someone just, this is possible, and then as more organizations take it on, you see, oh yeah, look, wow, it really works. So. Yeah, but ideally we want a huge fundamental culture shift in the way that nonprofits are done throughout the world. Yeah.
Perfect. I think that was all the questions that we had submitted, I believe. We'll chat out an email address to send any additional questions that you have. But thanks so much, Kinari, and thanks to everybody who came and participated. We appreciate it.
Oh, and I just saw there's a note from Hotland. So Hotland's my co-founder in Indonesia, and I'm so delighted that she's joining us. She's one of my key co-listeners. She was always amazing at it. Oh, and Arvian from Indonesia too. Hi. So actually he might be here in the Bay, but thank you all so much. Bye-bye.